The enigma of the cursed tomb. What lies beneath? What you're about to hear is not a legend. This tomb is real. It was uncovered in 2009 near Harran in southeastern Turkey, just a few kilometers from the ancient ruins of a city that once watched empires rise and fall. If you enjoy losing yourself in history's shadows, in truths that never made the textbooks, then this journey is for you. So before we begin, subscribe, not because I asked, but because you know, this won't be the last time you fall asleep to a story like this. Chapter 1, The Discovery. They were digging for a road, not archaeologists, just construction workers. They had no idea what lay beneath the clay and limestone, packed tight after centuries of dust storms and droughts. But when the first slab cracked open, smooth as polished basalt, something changed. No one spoke. One man dropped his tools and didn't pick them up again. The chamber they found was unlike anything catalogued in the region. No inscriptions, no ornaments, just a black stone doorway, sealed with bitumen and faint traces of red ochre smeared along its base. Someone, long ago, had closed it carefully, deliberately, almost as if to keep something inside. Local officials arrived within days, and with them came a quiet, chain-smoking archaeologist named Dr. Samal Yazici. He was known for keeping out of the spotlight. His passion was funerary architecture from the late Iron Age. But when he stood before the entrance, he grew silent, not awed, not curious, just alert, like he recognized something. The excavation was paused. The tomb was covered with tops. But that night, a team returned, authorized or not. They opened the seal. Inside, the air was dry, not stale, not musty, as if the tomb had been kept in perfect stasis. And in the center of the small chamber was a raised platform. On it lay a sarcophagus of black limestone, carved without decoration. No name, no title, no iconography, only a single groove running around its edge, like a lid meant never to be lifted. But they did. The lid slid with surprising ease, and inside was a skeleton, perfectly intact. The body had not been wrapped, not mummified, no amulets, no grave goods, just bones, long and slender, with hands folded over the chest, and where the skull should have been, there was nothing, no fragments, no dust. The spine ended cleanly where the neck had once begun, as if the head had never existed. Dr. Yazici recorded the discovery. He logged the measurements, collected samples of the surrounding soil, and sealed the chamber again. Officially, the tomb was never opened. No report was filed, and within months, the site was reburied, paved over, marked only as C-23 in the municipal records. But Yazici didn't stop. He traced references in ancient texts to the nameless sleeper beneath the Red Gate. He cross-referenced site maps from Hittite and Assyrian settlements, noting the absence of any known burials in the vicinity. And he began to write. Not a paper, but a journal. In it, he wrote of patterns in the tomb's construction, of eerie similarities to designs found much farther east, and of inscriptions recovered from a cave near Harran, which spoke of a guardian entombed for eternity, whose voice must not be heard. The journal ends in early 2011. The last page simply says, "Do not return. It is not a tomb. It is a prison." That page was torn out, and no one has seen Dr. Yazici since. Chapter 2. The Journal. The notebook smelled of mildew and tobacco. It had been left behind, tucked between cracked floorboards in a rented apartment near Mardin. No one had searched for it. The landlord had simply cleared out the unit when the payments stopped. Among the books and maps and weather documents was a single leather-bound journal. Its pages were filled with a narrow, slanted handwriting, urgent but precise. It belonged to Dr. Shemal Yazici. The early entries were methodical, descriptions of excavation sites, comparisons of funerary typologies, long passages on burial customs of the late Iron Age. He referenced known tombs from Harran, Nimrud, and even sites near Aleppo. But then, around page 20, the tone shifted. There were fewer citations and more questions. One entry stood out. He described a dream, though he didn't call it that. He called it a recollection. In it, he stood before the black tomb again, but this time it was not empty. The sarcophagus was open, and someone was standing behind it, not watching, not moving, just waiting. He wrote that the air tasted metallic, that he heard a low, rhythmic sound, almost like a heartbeat, but coming from the walls, and that when he tried to leave, his feet wouldn't move, not out of fear, but out of something he called reciprocal stillness. He woke gasping, but what troubled him most, he said, wasn't the dream. It was that when he looked at his own shoes in the morning, they were covered in dust, the kind found only in sealed places. Later pages grew darker, not frantic, never that, but more personal. He wrote about the black groove around the sarcophagus. He believed it wasn't decorative. He suggested it had once held a ring of salt, or something stronger, a substance used to bind, or to keep something from leaking out. He referenced an ancient text recovered in the 1930s, now housed in a forgotten archive in Adarna. The translation was fragmentary, but it spoke of a silent one who guards the edge of night. Yazici underlined that phrase several times. He believed the tomb was older than the Assyrians, older than the Hittites, possibly even pre-Sumerian. In one section, he mentioned bone samples. He said they were unlike any he had seen. The density of the femur was off by several standard deviations, and the marrow cavity was lined with a crystallized residue, something he had only seen once before, in the remains of a highland burial site, long considered ritualistic. The crystal, he wrote, was not native to the region, and when placed near iron, it pulsed faintly. He called it resonant stone, and claimed it was the key to understanding why the tomb was sealed and why the seal had failed. His final entries became sparse. One spoke of headaches, another of birds circling outside his window long after midnight. And then there was a sketch, a crude diagram of concentric circles, symbols surrounding a figure with no face. Its hands were raised, not in welcome, but in warning. Beneath it, he wrote, they knew what it was, and they tried to contain it, but the layers have thinned. The very last page was blank, except for a single line centered near the bottom. I don't dream anymore. I hear it now, when I'm awake. The journal was never published. It sat in a cardboard box, misfiled with other estate items, and when researchers finally examined its contents, nearly a decade later, the site had already been forgotten, covered, built over, left to sleep, or not. Chapter 3. The Return. They never meant to go back. The site had been paved over, classified as non-essential, and quietly erased from municipal records. But one evening in 2018, 2 archaeology students found a copy of Yazichi's journal online, scanned, misattributed, and buried deep in an academic forum. They didn't know who had uploaded it, but the file was dated the same day a small museum in Adarna reported a break-in. The students, Layla and Emre, were fascinated, not by the supernatural implications, but by the inconsistencies. The layout of the tomb didn't match any known culture. The lack of inscriptions, the absence of ritual objects, the missing skull. They believed it could be the earliest intentional burial site ever discovered in the region. Older than Göbekli Tepe, older than Catalhoyuk. They drove to Harran. At first, they couldn't find the coordinates. The road maps had changed. The old satellite images had been scrubbed. But then Layla noticed something. On a topographic map from 2010, there was a small elevation labeled C23. In newer maps, the same hill had been flattened, replaced by a stretch of asphalt and a concrete drainage channel. It was there. At dusk, they parked behind a line of olive trees. They brought a hammer, a folding shovel, and a hand-drawn copy of the tomb's layout from Yazichi's journal. They weren't trying to disturb anything. They just wanted to see it, to prove it was real. The concrete had cracked. Shifting soil had opened a narrow fault near a rusted drainage grate, and beneath it was darkness. They descended slowly. The air was cool and still, not cold, but absent, like it had never moved. The steps were made of stone, worn but intact, and at the bottom, just as the journal described, was the door. It was smaller than they expected, only shoulder height, sealed with bitumen so old it had hardened into stone. But someone had been there before. The seal was broken. They hesitated. Layla placed her hand on the threshold. It felt warm, not hot, but too warm for stone. Inside, the tomb was exactly as described. The platform, the black sarcophagus, the groove along the edge, now filled with dust and spiderwebs. But the lid was missing. It had been moved aside, and the inside was empty. No skeleton, no dust, not even a stain. Just the faint impression where something once lay. Long, thin, humanoid. But the headprint was still missing. Emre took a photo, just one, and the moment the flash went off, the camera died. So did the lights. They stood in the dark for 13 seconds, long enough to feel the floor beneath them shift. Not a tremor, not a collapse, but a shudder, like something below was adjusting, breathing. They left in silence. No words, no panic, just a calm, deliberate retreat up the stone steps. Neither of them spoke until they reached the car, and when they turned to look back, the grate was gone. No crack, no entrance, only smooth, undisturbed concrete. Emre tried to recover the photo, but the SD card was corrupted. When they opened the file, it was just noise, gray and red lines, static, except in the lower right corner, a faint shape, 2 hands, raised. Chapter 4. The Archivist. They were not the only ones who had seen the journal. In a quiet basement room beneath the library of Istanbul University, there worked an archivist named Selin Kaya. She was methodical, private, and known for her uncanny memory. She rarely spoke to colleagues and often stayed after closing hours, drawn not by deadlines but by questions. Her specialty was unclassified texts, forgotten fragments, misfiled manuscripts, and that's how she found the first clue. It was a letter, never sent, dated February 2011, 2 weeks after Yazuchi's last known correspondence. It was addressed to a professor in Vienna and tucked between pages of a miscatalogued Ottoman ledger. The handwriting was unmistakably his, but the language had changed. He no longer wrote in Turkish, not even in English. The letter was in Akkadian, flawless, formal Akkadian, used only in clay tablets, and dead for over 2,000 years. Celine translated it carefully. It wasn't a message. It was a warning. It spoke of a place where the barrier thins and a mouth that must never be opened. He described a chamber without time, a silence deeper than thought, and he mentioned the guardian who was not born, but formed. He ended the letter with a plea. Do not break the ring. It is not meant to hold. It is meant to contain, period. She copied the text by hand and began to search, not in the usual databases, but in collections forgotten by most historians, private dig logs, notes from 19th century missionaries, and there, in the field reports of a Prussian linguist named Otto Reflin, she found something chilling. In 1894, Reflin described a cave near Harran. He called it the Whispering Chamber. He claimed the walls were covered in spirals, etched so shallow they could only be seen in firelight. He and his guide entered at dusk. They heard nothing at first, but as they descended, they began to feel pressure behind their ears. A soft, insistent sound. Not quite a voice, just a vibration, like language trying to form itself. Ricklin wrote that they left within minutes, but when they emerged, the sun was gone. Night had fallen, though their watches said only an hour had passed. His guide aged 10 years in the weeks that followed. Hair turned white, teeth loosened. He refused to speak of the cave again. Celine noted the coordinates. They weren't far from C-23, too close to dismiss. She requested access to Yazuchi's private archives. What little remained, she was denied. No one remembered where they were stored. Some claimed they had been absorbed into museum collections. Others whispered they had been destroyed. But she kept looking. And one evening, while reviewing digitized index cards from a burned-out university storage wing, she saw a file labeled simply, Nameless Hold. The scan was damaged, but she could make out 3 entries. 1. Bone fragment, reclassified, non-human morphology. 2. Soil sample, electromagnetic anomaly. 3rd, lithic ring, missing, no record of removal. She didn't sleep that night, not because she was afraid, but because she began to remember things she had never known. Symbols she couldn't have seen, a whisper she couldn't unhear, and somewhere, just beyond her waking thoughts, a sense that something buried was no longer asleep. Chapter 5. The Repeater. They say patterns don't lie, but some patterns are harder to notice until it's already too late. The tomb near Harran was never unique. It was part of a design, a scattered, forgotten chain, buried across continents. In early 2020, a Dutch geophysicist named Marin Vos was analyzing magnetic anomalies in Anatolia. He wasn't looking for tombs. His research focused on fault lines and the subtle shifts of the Earth's crust. But when he overlaid his data with archived topographic maps, a pattern emerged. 7 sites, all within a corridor stretching from the Taurus Mountains to the Mesopotamian basin, each with a similar anomaly. Sharp magnetic distortion, no known mineral explanation, and one peculiar detail. Each site had a missing zone, a circular area where instruments simply failed. No readings, no echo, just silence. One of those sites was labeled C-23. Marine didn't know what it meant, but in a footnote on a weathered geological survey from 1972, he saw the phrase, unstable strata, not recommended for drilling, subject to deep, rhythmic pulses. That phrase stuck with him. He cross-referenced the other 6 locations. All had been logged by different teams, decades apart, but every report mentioned the same odd detail. Animals avoided the area. No birds, no burrows, nothing above and nothing beneath. He flew to Cgrapher. There he met a retired hydrologist who had worked near one of the marked sites in the 1980s. The man was reluctant to speak, but after a few drinks, he told Marin about a well that wouldn't stay sealed. They had tried everything, concrete, steel caps, even explosives, but the opening always returned, not in the same place. It would move, sometimes a meter, sometimes 2, as if the land itself refused to close it. He said the water tasted like rusted coins, and that when the wind blew from the south, you could hear breathing. Marine dismissed it at first, but when he visited the site himself, now overgrown with thorn bush and stunted olive trees, he brought a drone, not to dig, just to scan. The results were impossible. A perfect cylindrical void, 10 meters wide and hundreds of meters deep, completely smooth walls, no rockfall, no sediment layers, as if it had been bored straight through the earth, and at the bottom, nothing, no echo, just stillness. He published nothing, but late one night while rewatching his drone footage frame by frame, he saw it, for exactly 1 frame. The light caught something, not at the bottom, but on the wall, a handprint, inverted, pressed into the rock, with fingers far longer than any human's. He replayed the clip 100 times, and each time his chest grew tighter, not from fear, but from something he couldn't name, like an old rhythm, forgotten by the body, but not by the bones. He wrote to a colleague in Prague, a specialist in Paleolithic symbolism. He attached the frame and asked only, "Seen this before?" The reply came hours later. 1 line, "Yes, in Siberia, but that site collapsed in 1993. No follow-up, no explanation." The email address went dark. 3 days later, Marine disappeared. His equipment was found still powered on, the footage erased. Only his field notes remained. In the margins of his last page, he had written, "They are not tombs, they are vents." And next to it, a symbol, a spiral, drawn over and over, until the pen tore through the paper. Chapter 6. The Sleepwalker. It began with whispers in the city of Urfa, not loud, not sudden, just a few quiet cases. A museum guard who vanished during a night shift, his shoes left neatly beside the security desk. A historian who walked out of a lecture mid-sentence, crossed the courtyard barefoot, and was never seen again. Each case dismissed. Coincidence, stress, exhaustion, until they began to dream the same dream. A woman named Asya worked in the archives beneath the Cgrapher Museum. She was precise, respected, and utterly rational. But one evening, while cataloging Hittite seals, she dozed off. And when she woke, She was holding a shard of black stone. It hadn't been there before. She had no memory of picking it up. The fragment was cold, but not in a natural way. It felt like absence, like it wasn't supposed to exist in this world. She placed it in a sample bag, filed it. But that night, she dreamed. She stood inside a vast chamber of smooth, dark stone. The walls were carved in spirals, endless, interlocking, moving not with light, but intention. At the center was a narrow platform, and on it stood something tall and faceless. Its arms were outstretched, not welcoming, waiting. She couldn't speak, couldn't move. She only heard a voice, not from outside, but from within, and it said, "You brought me back." She woke, gasping, but she wasn't in bed. She was standing barefoot in the museum storage room, still holding the sealed bag. Security footage showed nothing, no movement, just a gap in the recording, 12 minutes of static. She tried to forget, tried to return to her work, but others had started to dream too. Not the same details, but always the spirals, always the platform, and always the absence of a face. Then one night, the stone fragment disappeared. No forced entry, no broken glass. It was simply gone, but in its place, on the archival table, was a symbol, drawn in salt, a spiral, perfectly symmetrical, still damp. Asha left Urfa the next day. She traveled north, searching for someone, anyone, who had seen what she had. And in the ruins of a burned-out monastery near the border, she found a journal. The ink had faded, the pages were brittle, but one sentence had been underlined 3 times. The sleeper beneath the ring does not dream. It waits until we do. She looked up the monastery's last abbot. He had died in 1937, but local legend claimed he had spoken in tongues during his final days. Not Latin, not Greek, but a sound described as stones grinding beneath water. Asya tried to sleep, but every time she closed her eyes, the spirals returned. Only now they were moving, coming closer. She recorded her dreams. She mapped them, not just as visions, but as locations, landmarks, ridgelines, elevation. And what she found shocked her. They aligned perfectly with the other tomb sites, the same spiral path, the same distances, as if the dreams were not dreams, but coordinates. And at the center of them all was Harran. She went back, not with tools, not with a team, just herself, a notebook, and the last page of her dream map. She walked to the cracked asphalt where C-23 had once been, and there, as if waiting, was a narrow slit in the ground, barely wide enough to slide through. She hesitated, then stepped forward, and disappeared. No one has seen her since, but in the weeks that followed, others began to report the same dreams. Different cities, different countries, but always the same center, always the same whisper. You brought me back. Chapter 7, The Language Beneath. The first sound came from deep underground. It wasn't loud. It wasn't even audible at first. Just a vibration, a gentle hum, barely touching the edge of perception. But once heard, it stayed. A linguist in Tbilisi was the first to notice, not in words, but in rhythm. She had been analyzing phoneme shifts in forgotten dialects of pre-Hurrian languages when her audio samples began to distort. The distortion followed a pattern. 5 pulses, then silence. Always 5. Then on the 6th repeat, it changed. The waveform revealed something unnatural. Not interference, not machine error. It was structured. A pattern that mimicked language, but wasn't one. A rhythm made to fit inside human ears, but not made by them. She ran it through spectrogram software. The visual output looked familiar, not as text, but as shape. Concentric spirals, not drawn, not symbolized, sung. The tone was constant, but the meaning seemed to grow. She played it again, this time through bone conduction headphones, and she felt it, not heard, felt. A pressure behind her eyes, a tingling in her jaw. A word she could almost understand, but never fully catch. She wasn't alone. Across the region, seismographs picked up inexplicable harmonics, not from tectonic activity, but from stillness, as if the earth itself was resonating. A single tone, broadcast from beneath the crust, targeted, timed, and ancient. One researcher mapped the frequencies over time. The pulses aligned with known tomb sites, not randomly, precisely, as if each site was a speaker, and something below was learning how to speak. In Ankara, a linguistics professor named Melik uncovered an unpublished paper from 1958. The author was a Soviet field agent stationed near Lake Van. The title was redacted, but the opening sentence remained. They are not dead. They are remembering, period. He traced the paper's origins to a forgotten field station, now nothing but rust and stone. Inside, he found reel-to-reel tapes, dozens of them, unlabeled. He played one. At first, silence. Then the same tone, faint, deep. Then a voice, not human, not monstrous either, just wrong. It repeated something, again and again, a single phrase, in a language Melik didn't know, but one his body reacted to. He vomited, his hands shook, his nose bled for hours, but he couldn't stop listening. Eventually, he recognized a pattern. The voice was asking a question, over and over, not to him, but to the tomb. And the tomb was answering. He isolated 2 words. One he translated as return. The other had no translation, only an approximation, unmaking. He destroyed the tape, or tried to, but that night, as he slept, his ears rang with the same tone, and in his dream, the spirals turned. But this time, they didn't pull inward, they expanded, outward, into him. When he woke, his apartment smelled of stone and iron, and written on the wall in lines of fine black ash was a single sentence. The ring is not a seal, it is a sentence. Chapter 8, The Ash Field. The soil had stopped growing things. No one noticed at first. The field near Harran had always been dry, dust-blown and brittle underfoot. But in late spring, when the rest of the region turned green, this one stretch remained gray. Locals called it Yanan Toprak, the burned earth. No fire had passed through, no chemicals had been dumped. But something beneath the surface had changed. The ground rejected life. A farmer named Hussein lived nearby. He had worked that land for 40 years. His family once harvested barley there, long before the asphalt road had been laid. But now he kept his distance. He said the ground was too quiet. When the wind blew, the grasses outside the field rustled gently, but within the boundary, Where the soil turned pale, there was no sound, no birds, no insects, just silence. He buried his dog there once, a small, quiet thing named Zeki. The next morning the grave was open, no signs of digging, no footprints, just the earth, smooth and flat, and no trace of the body. He didn't speak of it until years later. But when he did, his hands trembled. In 2022, a team of soil researchers from Istanbul University took interest in the site. They had read the geophysical anomalies in the region, and this patch of land caught their attention. They took samples. The top layer was unremarkable, clay and dust. But 15 centimeters down, the color shifted. Charcoal gray, dense, not burned, but compacted in a way no farming could explain. And within it were small, circular formations, not roots, not burrows, but rings, perfect rings, each no larger than a coin, made of a mineral they couldn't identify. One intern dropped her sample. The shard split cleanly down the middle. Inside was a cavity, and in that cavity was a tooth, human in shape, but too long and too smooth, almost as if it had never chewed, only waited. They logged to find, labeled the site for deeper excavation, but within a week, the entire team had abandoned the project. Not officially. They simply stopped responding. Emails bounced, phones disconnected. Their lab room, when opened months later, was empty. Only one document remained, forgotten in a shared cloud folder. It was a single-page note, no title, no signature, just a diagram, a spiral, with these words: "The ash isn't residue, it's leakage." And from the center of the spiral, lines spread outward, not in ink, but in thin traces of dust, embedded into the paper fibers. When the document was scanned, the spiral shifted, each pixel misaligned. The shape refused to stay still. Those who viewed the file began reporting the same symptoms: headaches, auditory distortion, vivid dreams of stone corridors, and a growing sense that something beneath their feet was listening. The field remains, unmarked, unprotected, forgotten by most. But the dog still won't go near it, and at night, when the wind is just right, the ash drifts, not carried by air, but as if drawn back toward the center, always toward the center. Chapter 9, The Children of Dust. They didn't speak of it, but the children knew. In a small village on the edge of the Syrian border, just west of Harran, something had begun to change. Not for the elders, not for the farmers, but for the children. It started with drawings. At first, just shapes in the dirt, circles, spirals, over and over again, pressed into dry earth with tiny fingers. They said nothing about them, but they kept drawing. One child, Fatma, age 7, began speaking in her sleep. At first, soft muttering, then full sentences, not Turkish, not Arabic, but a language no one recognized. Her parents thought it was just a phase, until one night her brother recorded it. A linguist from Gaziantep University reviewed the audio. He isolated the phonemes, and though the structure was unique, it shared tonal patterns with Proto-Euphratean, a language older than Sumerian, thought to be extinct before writing even existed. Fatma had never left her village, and yet, when shown satellite images of the area, she pointed directly to the old C-23 site. She said only one word: home. Another boy, Musa, began digging, not with tools, with his bare hands. He went out each morning to the base of a fig tree, scratched at the soil until his fingers bled. His father asked why. He whispered, "They forgot to close it." In the following weeks, several more children exhibited strange behaviors. They stopped eating certain foods, salt, honey, dried dates. They refused to cross running water. They drew the same symbol on their walls, on their school books, in steam on the windows. A spiral, not curling inward, but out. Teachers grew concerned. A psychologist was brought in from Shanlofa. He dismissed it as rural stress, too much upheaval, too many stories passed down without filter. But then one of the children, Layla, age 9, looked him in the eyes and said, "It's awake now. We only have until the 13th night." He left that evening, resigned and silent. By the next full moon, the fig tree near Musa's house had split down the middle, not from lightning, from below. Its roots had been forced upward, the soil beneath, dry, cracked, and circular. At the center was a ring of stones, perfectly arranged, each etched with lines so fine they resembled veins, or nerve endings. Local authorities paved over it, again, but the children kept drawing. One mother tried to stop her daughter, took away the chalk, scrubbed the floors. The next morning the girl had carved the spiral into her own arm with a sewing needle. No pain, just calm, as if it needed to be remembered. Eventually the drawings stopped, not because they were forgotten, but because they were no longer needed. The children began to sleep deeper, longer, and when they spoke in dreams, it was in unison. One night, a group of them gathered near the irrigation ditch that once bordered the old asphalt road. They stood silently, faced the east, and as the wind picked up, they spoke in a voice that wasn't their own. The village imam witnessed it. He said the ground trembled, softly, but with rhythm, and the words they spoke weren't prayers, they were a summoning. He left the village the next day, never returned. His house still stands, empty, but on the inside of his door, scratched faintly into the wood, is one last spiral and a sentence. "They were born near the breach, and they are remembering for us." Chapter 10. The Cartographer. He was looking for water, not answers, not legends, just a new aquifer. Yusuf Demir was a hydrogeologist. He had spent 20 years charting underground water systems across Anatolia. His work was precise, scientific. It left no room for myth, until he mapped beneath Harran. The initial scans were inconclusive. The top layers looked normal, hard pan soil, fossilized clay, dry as expected. But deeper down, at nearly 300 meters, something appeared. A void. Not irregular like a cave, not fractured like an ancient tunnel. A perfect hollow dot, cylindrical, smooth, and, according to his readings, alive. He dismissed the term. It was just a software glitch. The imaging software assigned activity levels to density anomalies, and sometimes it registered false positives. But the void remained. So he scanned again, and again. Each time the shape stayed the same, unchanged, fixed. But the readings grew louder. He had no better word for it. The data spiked in bursts, as if something beneath was responding, not with movement, but with pressure, as if the hollow resisted being seen. Yusuf presented his findings at a water symposium in Ankara. Most were uninterested. too abstract, too strange. But one attendee, a soft-spoken geographer from Georgia, approached him quietly after the session. She had seen something similar, north of Mount Ararat. Same pattern, same impossibility. She whispered, "We mapped a silence," and it stared back. Together they overlaid their maps. What they found was chilling. Each void was not random, each aligned along a single curving axis, an arc cutting beneath the surface of Mesopotamia like a buried spine. And at the center of the arc was C-23. Yusuf dug into historical records, not just archaeology but older, epigraphy, oral traditions, fragments recorded by missionaries, travelers, even shepherds. And he found it, a phrase repeated across centuries in different tongues. "The ring beneath the dust will breathe again." The same phrase had appeared in Syriac hymns, in Sumerian cautionary texts, even in a Roman soldier's graffiti near Edessa. It wasn't prophecy, it was memory. He returned to the field, this time not with sensors, but with maps, ink and parchment. He followed ancient landmarks, dry riverbeds, crumbled walls, forgotten boundary stones. And one night, beneath a blood-red moon, he found it, a depression in the land, barely visible, but unmistakable. It wasn't a hole, it was a seal, a circle of black stone, no wider than a man's height, half buried, but warm to the touch. When he laid his hand upon it, he heard nothing, but in that nothing there was weight. He pressed his ear to the stone, and from deep, deep below, he felt a pulse, slow, steady, older than language. He didn't report it, didn't mark the coordinates, he simply left. But on his final night in the village, he wrote a letter, addressed to no one, folded into his map book. It read, "There are no tombs, only reminders. The earth does not forget, it only waits." The next morning, Yusuf was gone. His car, untouched, his tent zipped, his boots still warm. And on the stone where he last stood, a spiral, etched not in dust, but in frost. Chapter 11. The Frequency. The signal wasn't meant to be found. It had no origin point, no timestamp, no modulation. But it was there, faint, persistent, and older than static. A postgraduate student in Berlin was the first to notice. He was reviewing Cold War transmission logs, number stations, encrypted broadcasts, ghost frequencies that once whispered across continents. But in the noise, he found a pattern, a carrier wave at 17.9 kilohertz, buried beneath decades of recordings. It wasn't voice, it wasn't code. It was tone point zero, always the same. A hum, almost imperceptible, barely louder than breath. But when amplified, it began to shape. Not music, not even sound exactly, but intent. He traced the signal backward. It didn't originate from any antenna. No atmospheric skip, no known source. Instead, it came from below. Across recordings from Iraq, Syria, eastern Turkey, every log showed the same tone. Faintest near the surface, louder near fault lines, loudest beneath ancient cities. He contacted a private observatory in Armenia. They had seismic microphones placed deep underground. He asked for their low-band recordings. What they sent him was not seismic activity, not plate movement, but something rhythmic, It pulsed every 61 seconds. A wave, a signal, a breath. Each pulse was followed by a pause, and within that pause, the frequency drift. The tone shifted, as if it were listening. He looped the wave into a spectrogram. The visual pattern that emerged was unmistakable. A spiral point. He tried to alert researchers, published an anonymous article, sent his findings to universities, institutes, cryptographers. Most ignored him. A few responded. One from Kyoto simply wrote, "You shouldn't be listening. It listens back." Soon after, he stopped responding to emails. His blog went silent, and when a friend visited his apartment, the lights were still on. The laptop was open, a waveform still on screen, but he was gone. Police found only one oddity, an old shortwave radio still tuned to 17.9 kilohertz, and beside it, on a notepad, one sentence scribbled over and over. "We mistook it for a tomb. It was a mouth." Chapter 12. What Lies Beneath? It has no name, not in any language we remember, not in any stone tablet, scroll, or sacred hymn. Only the spiral remains, etched into the dirt by hands that were not taught, but cold. In the weeks following the last disappearance, the earth grew restless, not with quakes, not with storms, but with a silence so vast it made sound feel foreign. Birds stopped migrating across the Mesopotamian corridor. Navigation systems near Harran began to flicker, just briefly, at nightfall, and those who slept closest to the old roads stopped dreaming. They didn't feel rested. They felt emptied. A small team of independent researchers formed in secret. Linguists, geologists, psychologists. They called themselves the Circle of 13. Not out of superstition, but because they could only find 13 places on Earth that matched the pattern. 13 sites where the stone was warm, where nothing grew, where the spiral could be felt beneath the feet. They met once, just once, in a candlelit room beneath the University of Tartu. Each brought a sample: soil, dust, stone, sound. When laid together, the pieces aligned, the tones matched, the symbols overlapped, and one woman, an archivist from Malta, placed her palm over the center of the spiral. She said, "It's not waiting, it's remembering, and now it knows we remember too." She died that night. No trauma, no cause, only a faint pattern burned into the flesh of her hand. Circular, tight, unbroken. The circle disbanded, their work scattered, their findings buried, some in vaults, some in graveyards, but the spiral never left. Now, people across the world have begun to draw it, not consciously, not even awake. They find it on notepads, on mirrors, on fogged windows. Children hum without knowing the tune. Dogs whimper at night, facing east. And in places where the earth once felt still, there is tension, the kind felt before a scream, before a breath, before language. You might be wondering what's beneath, what lies at the center, what's inside the tomb that wasn't a tomb, inside the mouth that wasn't meant to open. The truth is simple and unbearable. It was never sealed, only forgotten, not buried, not banished, just remembered into silence. But now we remember again, we name again, we ask again, and something answers in the soil, in the tone, in the breath between questions. Something listens, and just beyond the edge of knowing, It moves. The end. Thank you for listening, and sleep tight, if you can.